There was an entirely unintended consequence due to Prohibition in the US between 1920 and 1933, which was enacted ostensibly as a response to pre-existing social issues like domestic violence and child abandonment, whose presumed cause was alcohol. Strangely, drinking alcohol was not illegal, only the manufacture, transport and sale of it. But the temperance movement unwittingly invented and perfected a crime which is widely prevalent to this day, and perhaps is embedded in our culture. This is the Prohibition money laundering scandal. The history of money laundering traces back to over 2,000 years ago, when wealthy Chinese merchants started to clean their profits as a way to circumvent regional trading bans and taxes. In the US, it took off in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. The goal is to exchange the illegally acquired money, dirty money, for legally acquired money, clean money, and therefore avoid suspicion from law enforcement. As alcohol was made illegal in the US, a profitable black market soon arose to fill the booze gap. Organised crime boomed as the demand for alcohol rose. The temperance movement had popularised the belief that alcohol was the major cause of most personal and social problems, and Prohibition was seen as the solution to the nation's poverty, crime, violence and other ills. The country's first serious anti-alcohol movement grew out of a fervour for reform that swept the nation in the 1830s and 1840s. Many abolitionists fighting to rid the country of slavery came to see drink as an equally great evil to be eradicated. The temperance movement, rooted in America's Protestant churches, first urged moderation, then encouraged drinkers to help each other to resist temptation, and ultimately demanded that each local, state, and national government prohibit alcohol outright. The concept of banning drink had been around in America since the Civil War. This was mostly driven by the temperance movement, which largely consisted of women, conservative elements of the evangelical church, the suffrage movement, and the medical profession. When the Act came into law in 1920, it lasted until 1933. The motivation, it is said among other things, was keeping workers sober at work and prevent accidents, as the average person over 15 years old was estimated to drink around 7 gallons of booze a year, mostly spirits, and to reduce domestic violence and child abandonment caused by alcohol. In the 1820s and 30s, a wave of religious revivalism swept the United States, leading to increased calls for temperance, as well as other movements such as the abolitionist movement to end slavery. By the turn of the century, societies like the Women's Christian Temperance Union were a common feature in communities across the US, and they played a strong role in the temperance movement as alcohol was seen as a destructive force in families and marriages. In 1906, the Anti-Saloon League started a new wave of attacks on the sale of alcohol, driven by a reaction to urban growth and the influx of immigrants, as well as the evangelical movement and its view of saloon culture as corrupt and ungodly. Saloons were seen as synonymous with drunkenness, gambling, prostitution, drugs, and political corruption. Many factory owners during the Industrial Revolution supported Prohibition in their wish to prevent accidents and increase the efficiency of their workers in an era of increased industrial production and extended working hours. Prohibition was more popular in rural areas than in cities, which had seen a proliferation of secret bars and nightclubs. The alcohol industry was curtailed by a succession of state legislation, and finally nationwide under the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified on January 16, 1919. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment on December 5, 1933. Enabling legislation, known as the Volstead Act, set down the rules for enforcing the federal ban and defined the types of alcoholic beverages that were prohibited. For example, religious use of wine was permitted. Private ownership and consumption of alcohol were not made illegal under federal law, but local laws were stricter in many areas, some states banning possession outright. Americans who wanted to continue drinking found loopholes in prohibition laws or used illegal methods to obtain alcohol, resulting in the emergence of black markets and crime syndicates dedicated to distributing alcohol. By contrast, rates of liver cirrhosis, alcoholic psychosis, and infant mortality declined during Prohibition. It had a negative effect on the economy by eliminating jobs dedicated to the then fifth largest industry in the United States. It also substantially reduced the government's tax revenues at a critical time before and during the Great Depression. On October 28, 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act, the popular name for the National Prohibition Act, which came into effect on January 17th of the following year. Prohibition caused the shutdown of over 200 distilleries, 1,000 breweries, and over 170,000 stores selling alcohol. It is worth noting that the amount of money used to enforce prohibition started at about $6.3 million in 1921 and rose to $13.4 million in 1930, almost double the original amount. When beer was legalized in 1933, it created 81,000 jobs within 3 months. By 1925, there were around 3,000 speakeasy clubs in New York City alone. But there was a flaw at the heart of the provisions of the 18th Amendment. It banned the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol, with the exception of industrial, medical, and religious. But it did not outlaw consumption. Those who wanted to drink continued to do so, as the product flowed in from neighbouring countries, although it is believed that consumption did halve. This was still a long way from the ideals of the temperance movement, who wanted to eradicate it completely. As well as boosting organised crime and political corruption, the trend was away from beer to spirits, as the bootleggers made a larger profit. It was estimated that half the adult population continued to consume. The Act allowed wine and cider to be made from fruit at home, but not beer. Up to 200 gallons of wine and cider per year could be made, and some vineyards grew grapes for home use. Many people stockpiled for their personal use in the latter part of 1919, before sales of alcohol became illegal in January 1920. Since alcohol was legal in neighbouring countries, distilleries and breweries in Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean flourished as their products were either consumed by visiting Americans or smuggled into the United States illegally. Grape juice was not restricted by prohibition, even though if it was allowed to sit for 60 days, it would ferment and turn to wine, with a 12% alcohol content. Many people took advantage of this, as grape juice output quadrupled during the Prohibition era. Stores sold grape concentrate, with warning labels that listed the steps that should be avoided to prevent the juice from fermenting into wine. Home brewing good hard booze was easier than brewing good beer. Since selling privately distilled alcohol was illegal and bypassed government taxation, law enforcement officers relentlessly pursued manufacturers. In response, bootleggers modified their cars and trucks by enhancing the engines and suspensions to make faster vehicles that, they assumed, would improve their chances of outrunning and escaping agents of the Bureau of Prohibition. Supporters were initially surprised by what did not come to pass during the dry era. When the law went into effect, they expected sales of clothing and household goods to skyrocket. Property developers and landlords expected rents to rise as saloons closed and neighborhoods improved. Chewing gum, grape juice and soft drink companies all expected growth. Theatre producers expected new crowds as Americans looked for new ways to entertain themselves without alcohol. None of it came to pass. The unintended economic consequences didn't stop there. One of the most profound effects was on government tax revenues. Previously, many states relied heavily on excise taxes on alcohol sales to fund their budgets. In New York, almost 75% of the state's revenue was derived from liquor sales. With Prohibition in effect, that revenue was immediately lost. At the national level, Prohibition cost the federal government a total of $11 billion in lost tax revenue, while costing over $300 million to enforce. The most lasting consequence was that many states and the federal government would come to rely on income tax revenue to fund their budgets going forward. One of the legal exceptions of the law was that pharmacists were allowed to dispense whiskey by prescription for any number of ailments, ranging from anxiety to influenza. Bootleggers quickly discovered that running a pharmacy was a perfect front for their trade. As a result, the number of registered pharmacists in New York State tripled during the Prohibition era. Because Americans were also allowed to obtain wine for religious purposes, enrollments rose at churches and synagogues, and cities saw a large increase in the number of self-professed rabbis who could obtain wine for their congregations. The growth of the illegal trade also made criminals of millions of Americans. As the decade progressed, courtrooms and jails overflowed, and the legal system failed to keep up. Many defendants waited over a year to be brought to trial. As the backlog of cases increased, the judicial system turned to the plea bargain to clear hundreds of cases at a time, making it a common practice in American jurisprudence for the first time. The greatest unintended consequence was the plainest to see. For over a decade, the law that was meant to foster temperance instead fosters intemperance and excess. The solution the United States had devised to address the problem of alcohol abuse had instead made the problem even worse. The statistics of the period are notoriously unreliable, but it is very clear that in many parts of the United States, more people were drinking, and people were drinking more. The term organized crime didn't really exist in the United States before Prohibition. Criminal gangs had run amok in the cities since the late 19th century, but they were mostly bands of street thugs running small-time extortion and loan-sharking rackets in predominantly ethnic Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Polish neighborhoods. In fact, before the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1919 and the nationwide ban that went into effect in January 1920 on the sale of importation of intoxicating liquor, it wasn't the mobsters who ran the most organized criminal schemes in America, but corrupt political bosses, whereby the gangs were thugs in the employ of the political machines, intimidating opposition candidates and funneling votes to the boss. In return, the politicians and police chiefs would turn a blind eye to illegal gambling and prostitution rings. But the underworld power dynamics shifted dramatically with the onset of Prohibition and the overnight outlawing of every bottle of beer, glass of wine, and shot of booze in America. With legitimate bars and breweries out of business, someone had to step in to fuel the substantial thirst of the Roaring Twenties. And no one was better equipped than the mobsters. It wasn't long before they were raking in absurd amounts of cash, and it was the bosses and cops who were taking the orders. As the money kept pouring in, these formerly small-time street thugs had to get smart. They had to hire lawyers and accountants to launder the millions in ill-gotten cash, piling up each month. They also had to start thinking about strategic partnerships with other gangs and shipping logistics and property investment. Prohibition had created a black market that competed with the formal economy, which came under pressure when the Great Depression struck in 1929. State government urgently needed the tax revenue alcohol sales had generated. After 13 long years, the 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the US Constitution, and alcohol manufacture and sale was legal again. During Prohibition, there was an individual who stood out from the rest, who all but invented money laundering and made it a fine-tuned craft. He was renowned for his ability to create sophisticated money laundering schemes that allowed him to hide the origins of his illegally obtained funds. His name was Al Capone, and he was born in Brooklyn, a borough of New York City, on January 17, 1899. His parents were Italian immigrants, and his father was a barber and his mother a seamstress. Capone's family had emigrated to the United States in 1893. He showed promise at school, but had trouble with the Catholic rules, and he left at the age of 14, after he was expelled for hitting a female teacher in the face. Capone worked at odd jobs around Brooklyn and became involved with small-time gangs. In 1919, he left New York for Chicago and began as a bouncer in a brothel before climbing the ladder to more organized crime. Then, aged 26, he became the new boss of an organization that took in illegal breweries and a transportation network that reached as far as Canada, often with political and law enforcement protection. In turn, he was able to use more violence to increase revenue. Any establishment that refused to purchase from Capone often got blown up, and as many as 100 people were killed in such bombings during the 1920s. He was also seen as responsible for the proliferation of brothels in the city. It is rumoured that the term money laundering originated from Capone, as he set up laundromats across the city in order to disguise the origin of the money earned from alcohol sales. Any illicit profits would simply be added to the revenue generated by the laundromats and thus reintroduced into the financial system. Prior to the 1980s, money laundering was barely considered a crime. Tax evasion was the more serious offence, something that Capone was eventually sent to jail for. One of his primary methods involved investing in legitimate businesses, such as restaurants and nightclubs. These businesses served a dual purpose. On one hand, they generated legitimate revenue, providing him with cover for his criminal activities. On the other hand, they acted as a means to launder his illicit funds. By investing in cash-intensive businesses, he could mix his illegal proceeds with legitimate earnings. This made it difficult for law enforcement agencies to trace the source of his wealth back to his criminal activities. The revenue generated from these businesses could be used to purchase assets pay employees, and cover operational expenses, creating a facade of legitimacy. Al Capone's techniques have had a lasting impact on the evolution of modern-day money laundering practices. Criminal organizations today continue to employ similar strategies to obscure the origin of their illicit funds and integrate them into the legal economy. One key aspect of his influence is the creation of complex financial networks. Like Capone, modern criminals establish intricate webs of shell companies, offshore accounts, and nominee directors to conceal their true ownership and control over assets. These structures make it challenging for authorities to follow the money trail, the ultimate beneficiaries, or criminal proceeds. Capone's use of offshore accounts as a means of hiding and moving money has become a prevalent tactic in modern money laundering. Offshore jurisdictions with lax financial regulations and strict bank secrecy laws offer a convenient avenue for criminals to stash their ill-gotten gains. By transferring funds to offshore accounts, criminals can further distance themselves from the illegal source of their money. The demand for illegal beer, wine, and liquor was so great during Prohibition that mob kingpins like Capone were pulling in as much as $100 million a year in the middle of the 1920s and spending $500,000 a month in bribes to police, politicians, and federal investigators. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, the cash grab was over, but the sophisticated black market business schemes and money laundering tactics of organized crime were here to stay. The biggest gangs shifted their operations away from alcohol and into secondary businesses, like drugs, gambling, and prostitution. They also profited greatly from the Great Depression. Chicago politicians had long been associated with questionable methods, but the need for bootleggers to have protection in City Hall introduced a far more serious level of violence and coercion. Capone is generally seen as having had an appreciable effect in bringing about the victory of Republican mayoral candidate William Thompson, who had campaigned on a platform of not enforcing Prohibition, and at one time hinted that he'd reopen illegal saloons. Thompson allegedly accepted a contribution of $250,000 from Capone, and then beat Democratic candidate William Deaver in the 1927 mayoral race by a relatively slim margin. The key to Capone's downfall was the conviction on tax charges, not his spending, but proving his income, and the most valuable evidence in that regard originated in his offer to pay tax. Ralph, his brother and a gangster in his own right, was tried for tax evasion in 1930. He spent the next 18 months in prison after being convicted in a 2-week trial. Seeking to avoid the same fate, Capone ordered his lawyer to regularize his tax position, and although it was not done, his lawyer made crucial admissions when stating the income that Capone was willing to pay tax for various years, admitting income of $100,000 for 1928 and 1929. Hence, without any investigation, the government had been given a letter from a lawyer acting for Capone, conceding his large taxable income for certain years he had paid no tax on. On March 13, 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for 1924 in a secret grand jury. On the 5th of June, he was indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion from 1925 to 1929, and he was released on £50,000 bail. Capone was then indicted on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act. On June 16, 1931, at the Chicago Federal Building, Capone pleaded guilty to income tax evasion and the thousands of Volstead Act violation as part of a 2.5-year prison sentence plea bargain. But in July, The judge refused to honour the plea bargain, and Capone's counsel rescinded the guilty pleas. On the second day of the trial, the judge deemed that the 1930 letter to federal authorities could be admitted into evidence, overruling objections that a lawyer could not confess for his client. The judge later tried Capone only on the income tax evasion charges, as he determined they took precedence over the Volstead Act infringements. Much was later made of other evidence, such as witnesses and ledgers, but these strongly implied Capone's control rather than stating it. His lawyers, who had relied on the plea bargain that was refused to be honoured, and ran a weak defence focused on claiming that essentially all his income was lost to gambling. This would have been irrelevant regardless, since gambling losses can only be subtracted from gambling winnings. But he was further undercut by Capone's expenses, which were well beyond what his claimed income could support. But the judge allowed Capone's spending to be presented at very great length. The government charged Capone with evasion of $215,000 in taxes on a total income of $1,038,654 during the 5-year period in question. He was convicted on 5 counts of income tax evasion on October 17, 1931, and was sentenced a week later to 11 years in prison, fined $50,000 plus $7,692 for court costs, and was held liable for $215,000 plus interest due on his back taxes. A contempt of court sentence was served concurrently. New lawyers hired to represent Capone were Washington-based tax experts. They filed a writ of habeas corpus based on a Supreme Court ruling that tax evasion was not fraud, which apparently meant that Capone had been convicted on charges relating to years that were actually outside the time limit for prosecution. However, a judge interpreted the law so that the time that Capone had spent in Miami was subtracted from the age of the offences, thereby denying the appeal of both Capone's conviction and sentence. He was initially sent to Atlanta Penitentiary in May 1932, aged 33. Upon his arrival, Capone was officially diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. He was also experiencing withdrawal symptoms from cocaine addiction, and that formed part of the rationale for moving him to the recently opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. At Alcatraz, his decline became increasingly evident, as neurosyphilis progressively eroded his mental faculties. The formal diagnosis of syphilis for the brain was made in February 1938. He spent the last year of his Alcatraz sentence in the hospital section, confused and disorientated, and completed his term and was paroled on November 16, 1939. He spent the last years of his life at his Palm Island mansion, spending time with his wife and grandchildren. On January 21, 1947, Capone had a stroke, but did regain consciousness and started to improve, but contracted bronchial pneumonia. He suffered a heart attack on January 22nd, and on the 25th died after his heart failed. His body was transported back to Chicago a week later, and a private funeral was held. There was one man, above many at the time, who truly perfected the dubious art of washing illegal money on an industrial scale. His name was Meyer Lansky, one of Al Capone's contemporaries, although it is not known if they ever met, and ultimately he became the father of money laundering and was known as the mob's accountant. He was determined to avoid Capone's fate of a conviction in 1931 for tax evasion, and was the one responsible for figuring out how to use the Swiss banking system to hide his growing cash reserves. He was also instrumental in the development of the National Crime Syndicate in the United States. Originally, it is said he was from Poland and emigrated to the US in 1911 with his mother and brother Jacob and joined his father, who had immigrated in 1909. They settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Lansky met Bugsy Siegel when they were children, and they became lifelong friends, as well as partners in the bootlegging trade, with a reputation as one of the most violent Prohibition gangs. They had a vision to form a national crime syndicate in which the Italian, Jewish and Irish gangs could pool their resources and turn organized crime into a lucrative business for all. Lansky worked out that an effective way to launder money was by people gambling in casinos. It was very much a cash business, and illicit money could be added to the casino's income and thus appear to be legal. By 1936, he had established gambling operations in Florida, New Orleans, Cuba, and later in Las Vegas, even stretching as far as London. These gambling operations were very successful, as they were founded on Lansky and his connections, who had the technical expertise to manage them effectively, based upon Lansky's knowledge of the mathematical odds of most popular wagering games. He developed a gambling empire that stretched around the world. He also had a strong influence with the Italian-American mafia and played a large role in the consolidation of the criminal underworld. The full extent of his role can only be guessed at. Despite nearly 50 years as a participant in organized crime, Lansky was never found guilty of anything more serious than illegal gambling. He has a legacy of being one of the most financially successful gangsters in American history. Before he fled to Cuba, Lansky was said to be worth an estimated $20 million. When he died in 1983, his family learned that his estate was worth only around $57,000. He had been transferring over the years the illegal earnings from his growing casino empire to a Swiss bank account, where anonymity was assured by the 1934 Swiss Banking Act. Lansky eventually bought an offshore bank in Switzerland, which he used to launder money from a network of shell and holding companies. He retired to Florida, and his last years were spent quietly at his home in Miami Beach. He died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, aged 80, leaving a widow and 3 children. On paper, Lansky was worth almost nothing. At the time, the FBI believed he had left behind over $300 million in hidden bank accounts, but they never found any money.